What would you do if the HOA called the cops on you while you were camping on your own lake? I was standing under the Wyoming stars, a fire crackling at my feet, when red and blue lights cut through the trees like a warning I didn't deserve. One minute I was roasting a marshmallow on my family's land. The next I was being told to leave a lake I'd known since childhood. That's the night I learned the HOA hadn't just crossed a line. They'd built an entire world on my property. And tonight, they were ready to fight for a lie. The night had settled low over the Wyoming hills, the kind of quiet that hangs in the air like a held breath. Out by the lake, the only sounds were the crackle of my campfire and the soft ripple of water against the old wooden dock I rebuilt last summer. The glow of the flames danced across the surface of Mirror Point Lake, turning it into a moving sheet of gold. I leaned back in my folding chair, boots in the dirt, letting the cool wind slide past my face. This lake had been my refuge since my father first brought me here as a boy. It was the one place where the noise of the world never managed to follow. My pickup sat a few yards behind me, headlights off, tailgate down, cooler half open. I'd already grilled a couple of sausages and set a pot of coffee on a metal grate over the fire. The scent of pine needles mixed with wood smoke was familiar, almost comforting. Out here, everything slowed down. Out here, I could breathe. So when the first red and blue flashes bled through the tree line behind me, they didn't register as real. Not right away. The lights flickered across the surface of the lake, swallowing the gold and replacing it with streaks of cold color. A moment later, I heard tires crunching on the dirt path that led from the ranch gate down to the water. Mirror Point wasn't marked on any public trail map. It wasn't part of a campground or park. It was mine, tucked deep inside my family's ranch, far from anyone's business. So when I heard a voice bark, "Sir, step away from the fire and put your hands where we can see them," I thought for a second they had to be talking to someone else. I stood slowly, brushing off the bits of dried grass stuck to my flannel shirt. Two flashlights were pointed straight at me. Behind them, I could barely make out the silhouettes of two sheriff's deputies. They weren't moving recklessly, but they were tense, like they'd been told to expect trouble. I lifted my hands slightly, not in surrender, just to show I wasn't holding anything besides a half-roasted marshmallow on a stick. "I'm just camping," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "This is my lake." One deputy stepped closer. "We received a complaint from the Oak Creek Bluff HOA. They stated a trespasser was camping on the community lake without permission. Are you Remy Cole?" I nodded, still confused. "Yeah, and this isn't a community lake." But the deputy didn't relax. He exchanged a look with his partner, the kind people give each other when something stops adding up. The taller one shifted his stance like he was preparing to ask a harder question. The shorter deputy angled his flashlight around, scanning the shoreline as though expecting to find some hidden sign proving I didn't belong here. Behind them, the swirling patrol car lights washed the tree trunks in red and blue. The whole thing felt wrong in a way that crawled up the back of my neck. This lake was the heart of my ranch. I'd spent summers fishing here, winters checking the ice, entire years maintaining the little spillway that fed the creek down below. I'd walked the boundary lines myself too many times to count. My grandfather had taken me along as a kid when he would check the old survey markers hammered into the ground by men who'd been gone long before I was born. This place wasn't some neighborhood amenity. It was our land, our history. Yet here I was, being told to leave it. "Sir," the deputy said again, "the HOA president stated very clearly that this lake is under their jurisdiction. She's on her way down here to verify. Until then, we need you to step away from the fire." A cold knot tightened in my chest. I wasn't angry yet, just stunned. I looked past them toward the slope where the dirt path opened into the trees. More lights began cutting through the darkness. White headlights this time, more cars. I let out a slow breath, my eyes drifting back to the lake as the wind stirred the surface into 100 tiny ripples. The moon sat low above the ridge, pale and steady. Everything here belonged exactly where it had been for decades. Nothing had changed. Nothing except the fact that someone had decided to tell a different story, and the deputies seemed willing to believe it. I set the marshmallow stick down and stepped back from the fire, hands lowered but open. "I've lived here my whole life," I said quietly. "My family has owned this property since before Oak Creek Bluff even existed." "We're not here to argue with you," the deputy replied. "We just need to sort out the complaint." A door slammed in the distance, then another. Footsteps crunched on the path, more than 2 sets. I could make out voices now, sharper, more self-important. Someone was saying, "He has no right to be here," in a tone dripping with certainty. The deputies turned. I turned too. And standing beneath the bright headlights of an SUV was a woman in a tailored jacket holding a clipboard to her chest like it was a badge. Bethany Reed. I didn't know her personally, but everyone in the county had at least heard the name. HOA president for Oak Creek Bluff. The sort of person who believed rules were meant to keep certain people in line, and she was the one who got to decide who those people were. She walked toward us with a confidence that didn't match the fact that she was standing on someone else's ranch. "Officers," she called out. "That's him. He's been camping on our lake for over an hour." Our lake. The words hit harder than I expected. I looked at her, then back at the deputies, then out at the water, still shimmering under the lights, still unmistakably mine. A mix of disbelief and something colder settled into my stomach. For the first time that night, a thought pressed its brush into my mind, sharp as a fence staple. When did they start believing this lake belonged to them? And why did they think they had the right to call the cops on the man who owned it? Bethany Reed walked toward us with the kind of stride you usually see from people who never question whether they're right. The wind coming off the lake lifted the edge of her jacket as she approached, the silver rings on her clipboard glinting under the patrol lights. The deputies straightened a bit when she got close, as if she were someone they dealt with too often to ignore. She didn't bother looking at me first. She looked at the deputies, chin tilted just slightly upward, that practiced HOA confidence hanging off her like a tailored scarf. "Officers," she said in a brisk, clipped voice, "this area falls under the Oak Creek Bluff Homeowners Association. This man is trespassing on community property." Community property. The words floated in the air between us like an insult that hadn't fully decided whether it was personal yet. I stared at her, half waiting for her to crack a smile and admit this was all some misunderstanding. But her eyes, cold, dark, perfectly still, told me she wasn't confused. She was convinced. One deputy cleared his throat. "Ma'am, Mr. Cole claims this lake is on his ranch." Bethany let out a short laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Claims? Officers, we've been maintaining this lake for years. We've held member events, fishing workshops, paddle nights. We have maps, photographs, board documents. This isn't a debate. The lake is part of our community." The wind rustled through the pine trees overhead, pushing a thin sheet of ripples across the water. I stepped forward, planting my boots in the dust where the old cattle trail met the shoreline. "Ma'am," I said slowly, "this lake sits nearly a half-mile inside my ranch boundaries. There isn't a single public right-of-way that comes anywhere near it. How exactly do you figure it belongs to your HOA?" Bethany finally turned her eyes to me. She looked at me the way someone looks at a trespasser who's trying to talk their way out of trouble, not the landowner being accused of trespassing on his own property. "Mr. Cole," she said, with a thin, patient smile, "Oak Creek Bluff has used this lake every season since the community was established. My first year as president, we installed safety signs, erosion control blocks, and a shoreline path for residents. All of that was approved. You can't just appear out of nowhere and decide you own something because you say so. I blinked slowly, fighting the urge to laugh. I didn't appear out of nowhere. I live here, and you built things on land without knowing where the boundary lines even are. Her grip tightened on the clipboard. We know exactly where our boundaries are. We've managed this natural space for a decade. Residents expect it to be kept to certain standards. The deputies shifted uneasily, caught between an HOA president speaking with absolute confidence and a rancher standing 5 feet from a lake he'd grown up around. The taller deputy lowered his flashlight. "Ma'am, we're going to need to verify the property lines before taking further action." "You already have verification," Bethany said, tapping her clipboard. "I sent you the coordinates earlier. They align with the documentation we filed when the HOA expanded maintenance responsibilities around the North Ridge." I felt something cold crawl down my spine. Expanded maintenance responsibilities. Filed documentation. Using jargon like armor. I'd seen this game before. People using paperwork like a shield, hoping no one bothered to look closely at whether it meant anything. "What documentation?" I asked. "Show me." Bethany clicked her tongue. "This is official HOA property. I'm not required to show private association records to someone who isn't a resident." A heat rose in my chest that had nothing to do with the fire behind me. I took a breath, letting the cold night air steady me. Losing my temper wouldn't help anything. "You really believe this lake is yours?" I asked quietly. "It is ours," she replied. "It has been for years. And you don't get to waltz in and claim it's yours because you have a tent and a campfire." The absurdity of her words hung in the air. I looked to the deputies, expecting them to at least question the logic. But Bethany had that look, like she'd done this sort of thing enough times that people defaulted to believing her. Behind her, more HOA members came down the trail, phones lifted, their flashlight beams slicing into the darkness. Their voices carried across the lake like distant echoes, muttering things like, "Who is he?" and "I knew someone would try to steal our lake." Steal. My fists curled slightly. I forced myself to breathe. At moments like this, my grandfather's voice always resurfaced, steady and slow. "The land remembers the truth, son, even if people forget." I stepped closer to the deputies. "Officers, I can show you the deed. The original survey markers are still in place along the ridge. This is my ranch." Bethany's voice cut in, sharp as broken glass. "Your so-called deed is irrelevant. Usage determines jurisdiction here. The HOA has maintained this lake for over a decade. We even hosted our 4th of July celebration here last year." "That celebration was on my shoreline," I said, my voice dropping. "My land." She didn't flinch. "Then consider it poorly maintained on your part. We took responsibility because you didn't." Something inside me snapped. Not anger, not fear, but a realization. A hard, quiet click of understanding. She didn't think she was lying. She thought she was right. That made her more dangerous than someone who knew they were wrong. The deputies exchanged another uneasy look. The taller one finally spoke. "Ma'am, until we verify the property lines, we can't force Mr. Cole to leave." Bethany's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake. If he damages HOA property, that's on you." I almost laughed. HOA property, my lake, my dock, my shoreline. The shorter deputy looked to me. "Mr. Cole, do you have any documents on hand?" I shook my head. "Not here. They're at the ranch house." Bethany seized the moment like a hawk spotting prey. "Of course he doesn't. People like him never do. He probably found this spot on a map and thought he could get away with—" "That's enough," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried over the water like a low crack of thunder. She stopped talking. For a brief second, the night went still. No wind, no voices, no ripples. Just the weight of that moment pressing down on all of us. The taller deputy broke the silence. "Let's all just stay calm. We'll sort this out." Bethany took a long breath. then exhaled through her nose like she was bracing for a battle she'd already decided she'd win. "Fine," she said. "The HOA board is on their way. They'll verify everything." The sound of more engines echoed through the trees. Headlights flickered between the trunks. A line of vehicles approached. SUVs, golf carts, even a couple of lifted trucks idling like impatient animals. An entire HOA descending on my lake like they were the rightful owners. The world felt tilted for a moment, like I'd stepped sideways into someone else's story. But no, this was my land, my lake, my family's legacy, and somehow these people had convinced themselves it belonged to them. As the crowd gathered, their shadows stretching long across the ground, a chill settled into my bones, not from the cold, but from the realization blooming slowly in my mind. They didn't come here to talk. They came here because they believed they had authority, and no one who believes they're in charge ever backs down quietly. The line of vehicles crept down the narrow dirt path like a slow-moving parade, engines rumbling low under the night sky. Dust lifted behind them, drifting through the beams of headlights and rising like pale smoke between the pine trunks. The lake's calm surface caught every flicker, turning the water into a shivering canvas of white and amber light. I stood there, hands at my sides, steadying my breath as more people climbed out. Men in fleece jackets, women in yoga pants and reflective vests. A couple of teenagers still in their socks, like they'd sprinted out of their houses half-dressed after hearing the commotion. A few carried phones already recording, their screens glowing like tiny mirrors. One of them whispered, "That's him," as if pointing out a nuisance animal that wandered into the wrong yard. Another muttered, "He knew what he was doing," in a tone that implied I'd broken into their clubhouse instead of standing on my own soil. The deputies tried to place themselves between me and the crowd, but the group fanned out quickly, forming a loose half-circle that pushed closer with every minute. They weren't shouting, not yet, but the rising hum of irritation and certitude was unmistakable. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A single vibration, short, firm, familiar. I knew what it meant without looking. Marcus Hale was on his way. For the moment, though, it was just me, the deputies, and the swelling collection of neighbors who believed a lakeside campfire was an act of rebellion against their rules. Bethany stepped forward, lifting her clipboard with the stiff grace of a judge entering a courtroom. "As you can see," she said loudly, projecting her voice toward the deputies, "our residents are frightened. This is exactly why we enforce our regulations." Someone behind her added, "It's unsafe to have strangers camping on HOA land," while another piped in, "This is why we pay dues, so someone makes sure things are handled." A few nods rippled through the group. Strangers on HOA land. My jaw tightened just slightly, but I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even step toward them. I just stood there, hands loose, boots planted in the dirt that had belonged to my family long before Oak Creek Bluff was even a draft on a developer's desk. "Folks," the taller deputy said, lifting his hands, "we're trying to sort out the property question. Let's keep this civil." "It is civil," Bethany replied sharply. "We are protecting our rights. The HOA bylaws clearly outline usage agreements for all shared natural spaces. He is in violation of multiple sections." "Sections of your bylaws," I said calmly. "Not the counties, not the states, not the original deed for this land. You don't get to write rules for lakes you don't own." An older man near the front, wearing a fishing vest over a polo shirt, snorted. "We've been fishing here every weekend since I moved in. Don't tell me this isn't our lake." "That doesn't make it yours," I replied. "It makes it a place you've used, without asking." A low rumble of disapproval rolled through the group. Someone's dog barked sharply from one of the trucks. The wind blew in from the north, carrying the scent of wet earth and the faint metallic tang of the lake's deeper water. I held on to that scent, let it pull me back, steady my thoughts. Losing my cool wouldn't do any good tonight. My grandfather always said nothing grows fast on this land, except trouble. Everything else takes patience. So I waited. And after a long minute, the sound of a familiar engine echoed down the trail. Not the eager growl of a lifted truck, not the hum of a hybrid, but the steady, work-worn rumble of a county vehicle that had seen more ranch roads than pavement. A white SUV appeared between the trees. Its headlights hit the crowd, scattering shadows in all directions. The driver's door opened before the engine even shut off. Sheriff Marcus Hale stepped out, hat brim low, jacket zipped against the night breeze. He had that same deliberate, no-nonsense walk he used whenever he sensed a situation needed someone with enough backbone not to get pushed around. Conversations faded, phones dipped. Even Bethany straightened, clasping her clipboard tighter. Marcus stopped beside the deputies, eyes sweeping the scene, landing on me last. He didn't need to ask what happened. The mess explained itself. "Evening," he said slowly, the word drifting across the lake like a stone, skipping once before sinking. "Somebody want to explain why half the Oak Creek Bluff HOA is standing on private ranch land after 10 o'clock at night?" Bethany stepped forward before anyone else could speak. "Sheriff Hale, thank you for coming. As I told the deputies, this lake is part of our community's managed property. This man is trespassing and refusing to leave. The HOA has documented usage and maintenance records dating back." Marcus lifted a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Bethany, before you go through your binder, answer me one thing." She blinked rapidly. "Of course." "Where exactly?" he asked, pointing a slow finger toward the ground. "Do you think you're standing right now?" Bethany straightened even more. "On the northern edge of Oak Creek Bluff, on community recreational space." Marcus's eyebrow twitched, the closest he ever came to laughing in someone's face. "You're standing on the coal ranch, and the only recreational space out here is whatever Remy allows on his property." The crowd murmured, stunned for a moment. I watched the confusion ripple through them like wind through tall grass, small, uneasy shifts. Bethany didn't waver. If anything, she braced. "Sheriff," she began, "our board has documentation showing that Oak Creek Bluff has held events at this lake for many years. We have maps that clearly show—" "You have HOA maps," Marcus said flatly. "HOA maps aren't legal surveys." Someone behind her whispered, "What does that mean?" "It means," Marcus continued, "you can't claim land because you held a barbecue on it." A few heads turned toward me, some shocked, some suspicious, a few downright irritated. Bethany dug her heels in. "We didn't just hold barbecues. We built infrastructure. We maintained this shoreline. We installed—" Marcus cut her off again, turning to me. "Remy, you got your papers at the house?" I nodded. "In the safe." Bethany's eyes flashed. "He's stalling. He's—" "Ma'am," Marcus said, his voice dropping low, "you called in a trespassing complaint. So far, the only group trespassing is the one you brought with you." The wind hissed across the water. Voices fell quiet. The faint crack and pop of the dying campfire filled the silence. For a moment, everything stilled. The dirt road, the lake, the trees. Even the crowd seemed frozen, unsure whether to push forward or pull back. And in that suspended breath of a moment, one thing became painfully clear. We weren't dealing with a misunderstanding. We were dealing with a belief, one so strong the entire HOA had wrapped itself in it. People don't give up ideas like that gently, especially not when they've built their own world around them. The wind shifted, carrying the cold scent of the lake up through the clearing. The crowd pressed in tighter, a shuffling wall of jackets and crossed arms, their faces lit by the steady swirl of patrol lights behind the deputies. Bethany stood in front of them like a self-appointed commander, chin raised just high enough to signal that she believed she still had the upper hand. Then she said the sentence that changed everything. "We've built docks, trails, and a gazebo around this lake. All of it maintained under HOA authorization. Her voice wasn't loud, but the weight of the words cracked through the night like a dry branch snapping under a boot. For a moment, even the wind stalled. Marcus turned his head slightly, his brow pinching as the sentence settled in. The deputies froze mid-breath. I felt the ground tilt beneath me, not from shock, but from clarity, sharp and sudden. A dock, a trail, a gazebo, on my land, on the protected shoreline that wrapped around Mirror Point Lake, on the buffer zone listed in the very deed my grandfather kept framed on his office wall. I stepped forward slowly, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile silence that had descended. "You built structures here?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Bethany blinked, surprised that I didn't already know. "Of course we did. We approved them at multiple board meetings. The trail improvements alone cost several $1,000s. Our residents expect amenities that reflect the value of the community." I stared at her hands, the manicured nails wrapped around her clipboard, the silver pen poised like a tiny spear. She wasn't lying. She was proud. She believed every word she said. That was the part that made my stomach tighten. "Bethany," I said quietly, "you built all that without ever checking who owns the land?" Her eyes narrowed. "We didn't need to check. The HOA has used this space for years. That's enough." "It isn't," Marcus said, his voice heavy. "Usage isn't ownership." The older man in the fishing vest stepped up behind her. "Sheriff, we've been using this lake since the early days of the neighborhood. Kids swim here every summer. We built the gazebo for community events. How is that not ownership?" "Because you never had permission," I said. The fishing vest man snorted. "Maybe you're the one trespassing. Ever think of that?" My blood chilled, not from fear, but from the realization of how deep the delusion ran. When enough people repeat the same story, they stop seeing it as a story. They start calling it truth. Bethany lifted her chin again. "Sheriff Hale, this entire situation is a waste of resources. The HOA has jurisdiction here, and this man is violating—" Marcus stopped her with a raised hand. "Hold on." His tone shifted. Not angry, not frustrated, just precise. "What exactly did your HOA build?" he asked. Bethany tapped her clipboard twice, flipping through her papers with crisp movements. "A gazebo on the north ridge, a fishing dock on the west curve, an improved trail around the eastern shore, and erosion control blocks along the bank." Marcus stared at her for a long second, his jaw tightening. "And you installed all that without ever submitting a county permit?" "We didn't need to," she said. "This is HOA-managed property." The deputies exchanged a look. One of those quiet, subtle looks that said they were starting to realize they'd walked into something far bigger than a trespassing complaint. Bethany didn't see it. Or maybe she ignored it. The crowd shifted again, murmuring. Some of the HOA members looked at me with unease now, as if a hairline crack had formed in the narrative they'd been fed for years. Others crossed their arms harder, refusing to budge even an inch. I let the silence thicken, then said, "The dock you built sits right where my grandfather installed the first intake pipe for the ranch's irrigation system. That's protected land. The ridge where you put your gazebo is within my deed's restricted buffer zone." Bethany scoffed. "Your deed is outdated. The HOA has kept this lake functional. We stabilized the shoreline after a storm 2 years ago." "It didn't need stabilizing," I replied. "The lake rises and falls naturally. What you saw as erosion was the seasonal runoff." She waved a hand dismissively. "Regardless, we improved the area." "On land you don't own," I repeated. The murmurs grew louder. A woman in a red jacket whispered, "Wait, buffer zone?" to the person beside her. Another man frowned, glancing at the lake with new uncertainty. Marcus took a slow step forward. "Bethany, until proper documentation proves otherwise, you and your HOA may have constructed unauthorized structures on private property." Bethany straightened, eyes widening, but she didn't step back. "Sheriff Hale, you can't be serious." "I am." Her lips parted, but no words came out. She looked at the people behind her as if expecting them to rush to her defense. A few nodded weakly, unsure. Others avoided her eyes. This wasn't the victory I wanted. Not yet. This was something different. This was truth cracking through a wall of assumptions. I walked toward the edge of the dock they'd built, the planks pale under the swirling lights, the wood still smelling faintly of stain. I'd always avoided it, thinking the HOA had built it on their side of the land. But now I saw it clearly. The angles, the placement, the slight bend of the shoreline. All of it sat on my ranch. I turned back to face them. "Tell me something, Bethany," I said. "When exactly did the HOA decide the lake was part of your community?" She hesitated, just long enough for it to matter. "We inherited it from the previous board," she said, voice thin now. "It was always presented that way." Marcus inhaled slowly, the breath of a man who'd seen too many disputes start with that same line. Presented isn't the same as proven. Bethany's mask cracked. Just a hair, but enough to see the tension underneath. Behind her, a young man holding a phone whispered, "Didn't the developer say something about shared water access?" Another answered, "Yeah, but I don't know if that means the whole lake." Third voice, "I thought the ranch allowed it." Allowed, not owned, allowed. That single word lingered like a soft echo. Bethany sensed the shift and tried to grab it back. "Sheriff, the HOA will provide the necessary documents. We have maps going back 10 years showing this lake as part of Oak Creek Bluff." I stepped closer, stopping just short of her clipboard. "Your maps aren't legal. They're internal drawings, artistic diagrams, informational pamphlets. Your HOA can't redraft county lines with colored markers." Her mouth tightened. "Our records are valid." "No," I said. "They're convenient." The wind kicked up again, rattling the branches above us. The fire behind me crackled, spitting a tiny spark upward before settling back into its orange glow. Marcus finally spoke again, slow and firm. "Everyone needs to stand down until we verify the county plats." Bethany lifted her chin defiantly. "We're not leaving. Not until this is resolved. The HOA board is bringing more documentation." I exhaled. Long, steady, controlled. "Then I'll get mine too." Her eyes flicked with something sharp, challenge, anger, maybe fear hiding under layers of certainty. "Good," she said. "Let's see what your papers say." I nodded. "We will." The night stretched between us, thick and electric. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. This was a line drawn in the dirt, and they'd just admitted, in front of me, the deputies, and half their neighborhood, that they'd built their world, trails, docks, gazebos, rules, on land that was never theirs. The crack in their story had become a fracture, and fractures only ever go one direction, wider. By the time the HOA crowd finally retreated up the dirt path, grumbling, muttering, some still filming pointless clips for whatever group chat they'd gossip in later, the fire by my campsite had burned down to embers. The deputies followed Marcus back toward the trailhead, talking in low tones about permits and boundaries. Bethany lingered just long enough to shoot me one last look, the kind someone gives a problem they can't quite categorize yet, but fully intend to solve. Then she turned, boots crunching on the gravel, clipboard tucked tight under her arm, as though the papers inside held absolute truth. The wind pushed a few strands of her hair across her face, but she didn't bother fixing them. She was too focused, too determined, too sure she still had the upper hand. When the last set of headlights disappeared beyond the hill, the lake returned to its natural rhythm, a soft, steady lapping against the bank. the faint rustle of cattails, the sigh of night wind drifting through the trees. The sudden quiet settled like a blanket over the clearing, a cold one, heavy. I stood there alone, the dark stretching around me, illuminated only by the fading glow of the fire and the pale reflection of the moon on the lake. The night felt different now, less safe, less certain, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which truth would survive the coming storm. I kicked dirt over the fire, grabbed my gear, and made the short walk back to my pickup. The door creaked when I opened it, the same way it had for years. The keys jingled in my hand. Familiar sounds. Grounding sounds. The road up to the ranch house wound through a stretch of pasture dotted with sagebrush and old fence posts. The headlights swept across them as I drove, illuminating each post for just a heartbeat before darkness swallowed it again. The sky above was a wide, star-dusted dome stretching clean to the horizon. The kind of sight that usually steadied me, reminded me of simpler truths. Not tonight. Tonight, the stars looked like cold witnesses. When I reached the house, the porch light cast a warm cone across the gravel. The structure itself had a kind of quiet resilience. Aged pine siding, stone chimney, a roof built to handle Wyoming winters. My grandfather built the place with his own hands, each board nailed with purpose. It always smelled faintly of cedar and old books when you walked inside. I pushed through the front door, set my keys on the counter, and grabbed a match from the tin near the stove. A single strike brought the lantern to life, its warm yellow light spilling across the old wooden table in the living room. The safe sat in the corner, half hidden behind a leather chair, a heavy steel box my grandfather installed decades ago. I knelt down and spun the dial, listening to the clicks like they were the beats of a familiar song. When the lock released, the sound echoed louder than it should have in the quiet room. Inside lay a stack of papers, survey maps so old their edges had curled, folded deeds with county seals, irrigation schematics from when my grandfather worked with the Bureau of Reclamation, and a half-dozen handwritten notes he'd tucked between pages over the years. I pulled everything out and set it on the table. The lantern cast soft shadows across the documents as I spread them open. Paper rustled with the gentle sound of something fragile stretching after years of sleep. The oldest map, a hand-drawn topographical sketch, still bore the faint smell of pencil lead and dust. My grandfather's distinct handwriting labeled key points around the lake: North Ridge, intake line, unauthorized access, monitor, and circled several times, buffer zone, no construction. I traced the outline of Mirror Point Lake with my finger. Even after all these years, the contours of its shoreline matched my memory exactly. The western curve, where the dock now sat, the eastern slope where the HOA carved their trail, the northern rise where the gazebo perched like a crown they believed was theirs. My grandfather had marked that ridge with a thick line, a line Bethany never bothered to look for. I leaned back in my chair, letting the lantern glow soften the room. The house creaked gently in the settling cold. Outside, a gust of wind brushed against the window, carrying the faint sound of cattle moving somewhere out in the pasture. My grandfather's voice echoed in my mind, deeper than memory should allow. Land remembers the truth, Remy. Sooner or later, someone will try to rewrite it. That's when you hold the line. I exhaled slowly, rubbing my thumb over the embossed edge of the ranch deed. The paper was thick, worn, and warm from the lantern heat. It spelled out everything in black ink: the acreage, the water rights, the buffer designations, the flow channels feeding the pasture's irrigation. Everything the HOA pretended didn't exist. Except now their own words had given me something far more potent than anger. They had given me evidence. Their admission, spoken with absolute certainty and witnessed by deputies, was a confession wrapped in arrogance. They built structures, on restricted land, on land they never owned. But I needed more than old maps and my grandfather's notes. I needed confirmation, documentation, someone who knew the legal weight of these lines. I stepped away from the table, grabbed my phone, and scrolled until I found the name. Sarah Mitchell, land and water rights attorney. Someone I trusted. Someone who understood this land almost as well as I did. The call rang twice before her calm voice answered. Remy, everything all right? I looked at the spread of papers on the table. The maps, the deed, the warnings written decades ago. No, I said quietly, but I think I know exactly where to start. The lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the documents. The lake's reflection, hours old but still fresh in my mind, shimmered like a question waiting to be answered. Tonight, the doubts had grown. Tomorrow, the truth would have to grow bigger. I woke before sunrise, long before the first band of pale orange light touched the ridge above the ranch house. The air was cold enough that my breath drifted in thin clouds as I stepped onto the porch. The land was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles over Wyoming plains when the world is still deciding whether it's ready to wake up. A soft hum of wind pushed through the tall grass. The boards under my boots creaked the way they always had. Steady, familiar, a reminder that some truths don't move no matter who tries to rewrite them. Inside, the documents from last night still lay across the table. The lantern had burned out sometime after I'd fallen asleep in the chair, leaving a faint ring of soot on the glass. The maps looked older in the cool morning light, as if time had brushed over them during the night, sharpening the warnings my grandfather left behind. Each curve of shoreline, each hand-drawn arrow marking runoff channels, each note about the buffer zone, all of it pulsed with new meaning. I poured a cup of coffee, black and strong, and dialed Sarah's number again. She picked up on the first ring. "Morning," she said, her voice sounding clearer than any sunrise. "You ready?" "As ready as I can be," I replied. "You coming out here, or should I bring everything to your office?" "I'll come to you," she said. "I want to see the land myself. Sometimes the truth is easier to spot on the ground than on paper." She arrived 40 minutes later, her SUV crunching across the gravel drive. Sarah Mitchell wasn't the kind of attorney who wore suits when she didn't have to. This morning she wore boots, jeans, and a canvas jacket zipped halfway up. Her dark hair was pulled back, and her expression, sharp, thoughtful, didn't shift much even as she stepped out and looked across the ranch. "You weren't kidding," she murmured, scanning the horizon. "This is a lot of land." "Hundreds of acres," I said, "and one lake a few people want to pretend belongs to them." She gave a small, humorless smile. "Let's take a look." Inside, I spread out the documents again. Sarah pulled a pair of reading glasses from her jacket pocket and leaned over the table, her hands resting lightly on the maps. She studied the deed first, tracing the legal descriptions with her fingertip, lips moving silently as she read. After a minute, she looked up. "Your grandfather was meticulous." "He was," I said quietly. She turned her attention to the oldest survey map. "This is original county work," she said, "not HOA material. These lines were signed off by a certified surveyor. The lake, the buffer zone, the intake line, they're all clearly within the Cole Ranch boundary." I nodded. "I've walked those lines plenty of times." Sarah exhaled through her nose, a slow release that told me she was already forming a legal strategy. "If what you told me last night is accurate, if the HOA built structures on that buffer zone, they're in violation of at least 2 county regulations, maybe more, depending on whether they disturbed any protected soil or natural drainage. They built a gazebo on the ridge," I said, "and a dock right over the intake." Sarah's eyes darkened. "The intake zone is a protected area. Tampering with it carries fines, sometimes criminal penalties." I watched her expression shift, calculation sharpening into certainty. They'll argue usage, I said. They already did last night. She nodded. Usage doesn't override legal ownership. It never has. And their bylaws mean nothing off their mapped jurisdiction, which, she tapped the map twice, doesn't include your lake. We spent another half-hour going through each document, line by line. The room filled with the soft sounds of paper sliding, pens tapping wood, coffee cups setting down with small, deliberate thuds. Every so often, Sarah would murmur something like, unlawful encroachment, or misrepresentation of jurisdiction. Words that made the problem feel both bigger and more manageable at the same time. When she finally leaned back, arms crossed loosely, she said, "They're overreaching, badly, but that doesn't mean they'll back off, especially if they've spent years building up this idea that the lake is theirs." "That seems to be exactly what happened," I said. Sarah looked at me for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in thought. "Remy, they might not be confused. They might be counting on you being the one who doesn't push back." I took a breath that felt heavier than any I'd taken last night. "I won't let them take this place." "I know," she said, "which means we need to prepare." She folded the deed carefully, smoothing the edges as though the paper itself deserved respect. "First step, we document everything. I need photographs of the dock, the gazebo, the trail, anything they constructed. The closer we get, the better." "They'll be angry if they see me walking around taking pictures," I said. Sarah smirked. "Good. Anger makes people careless. Careless people tell the truth by accident." Her confidence steadied me. For the first time since the deputies arrived last night, I felt something warm cutting through the shock and frustration. Not relief, exactly. More like momentum. "Let's head out," she said. We climbed into her SUV and drove back down the winding road toward the lake. Morning light filtered through the pines, turning the forest floor gold. The air was warmer now, but a crisp breeze still carried the scent of dew and earth. When we reached the clearing, the lake was still calm, almost too calm. The gazebo on the north ridge stood out like an accusation, its polished wood catching the sunlight. The dock stretched across the water in a straight line, perfectly aligned with where the intake lay beneath. Sarah stepped out and surveyed the scene, her eyes tracing invisible borders across the land. "They built all this without a single permit," she said softly. We walked the shoreline, taking photos, marking angles, tracing the path of HOA construction. Each structure seemed to tell its own story, a story of assumptions layered on top of pride. At the gazebo, Sarah crouched near the foundation and brushed her fingers over the disturbed soil. "They cut into your buffer zone," she said. "Deep." She stood slowly, turning toward me. "Remy, they didn't just use your land. They altered it." Her words settled heavy in the air. We finished the survey and walked back toward the SUV. Sarah flipped through the images on her phone, nodding to herself. "This is enough to open a case. More than enough." I looked out across the lake, the surface now rippling from a rising breeze. Sunlight broke through the clouds above, scattering silver freckles across the water. The truth was starting to take shape. Not just the truth about county lines and buffer zones, but the truth about something deeper. Something that stretched back to my grandfather, to the old warnings scrawled in the margins of the maps. "Remy," Sarah said gently, "you're not dealing with confusion. You're dealing with entitlement." I nodded slowly, the weight of realization settling into place. "And entitlement," she added, "has a way of making people bold in all the wrong ways." The wind shifted again, rippling the lake. The doubts from last night were gone. In their place stood something sharper, something clearer. The kind of truth you don't walk away from. Sarah and I drove back from the lake with the windows cracked open, letting the cool Wyoming air sweep through the SUV. The scent of pine and damp soil drifted in, mixing with the faint warmth of the rising sun. Even the light looked different, less like morning and more like revelation settling over the ranch. By the time we pulled into the gravel drive, the sky had shifted into a pale blue dome with streaks of gold stretching over the hills. Sarah parked near the barn, stepping out with her phone still in her hand, flipping through pictures as though checking for inconsistencies that didn't exist. "They didn't even try to hide it," she muttered. "This is sloppy work for people so confident." "Arrogance is sloppy," I said. We walked into the barn office, the faint smell of hay and old tools lingering in the air. Dust floated in thin beams of sunlight coming through the high windows. I cleared the workbench of a few spare fittings and spread a clean sheet of brown paper across it, smoothing down the corners. Sarah began sorting the printed photos, laying them out like evidence cards in a courtroom. Dock foundation, gazebo posts, cut trail edges, disturbed soil by the intake line. "Now," she said, "let's talk about money." I raised an eyebrow. "Money?" She pointed to one photo, an angled shot of the gazebo where you could see small metal plaques screwed into the corner. "They put up a donor plate. That means HOA funds were used, and if HOA funds were used on your land, and they claimed jurisdiction." She paused, letting the weight settle between us. "That's financial misrepresentation." The barn felt suddenly colder. Sarah pulled her laptop from her bag and opened it, the screen lighting up the shadowed space as she typed quickly. "I've handled HOA cases before," she said. "Most overreach, but few are this bold. If they've been using member dues to maintain or expand onto land they don't own, it's not just trespassing anymore. It's unauthorized development funded by residents under false pretenses." I leaned on the workbench, watching her fingers fly across the keys. "You think they kept records?" She gave me a small, knowing smile. "HOAs keep records of everything. They love documentation. It's their security blanket. And if they spent money, there's a trail. Transaction logs, meeting minutes, annual reports." I pictured Bethany's clipboard, the way she clutched it like it held commandments from the mountain. "Then we find their records," I said. Sarah nodded. "We don't ask them. We pull public filings. Anything submitted to the county becomes part of the record. And a lot of HOAs file more than they need to, thinking it makes them look official." We worked for the next hour with the kind of focus that made time melt away. Sarah downloaded minutes from HOA board meetings, skimmed through newsletters, tax documents, community improvement reports. I sifted through more of my grandfather's files, searching for anything that might sync with their claim of historic use. Then Sarah stopped typing. Her eyes narrowed. She leaned closer to the laptop screen. "Oh," she whispered. "Remy, they never expected anyone to look this closely." She turned the screen toward me. An HOA report dated 5 years earlier. A highlighted line under Community Improvements. Allocation approved for shoreline restoration and recreational enhancements around Mirror Point Lake. My chest tightened. Mirror Point Lake. They used the name. My grandfather's name. The original name filed on the deed. "Scroll up," I said. Sarah kept scrolling, and with each line the page grew worse. They approved budgets for maintenance equipment. They approved funds for shoreline lighting. They approved contractor bids for dock reinforcement and trail grading. They approved event budgets on HOA lake property. Every line assumed ownership. Every chart reflected stewardship. Every expense was made on the foundation of a lie. "Sarah," I said, voice low, "this is fraud." She nodded. "Yes, and if the residents didn't know, it's misappropriation of dues." I took a slow breath, letting the weight of that land squarely settle across my shoulders. Not the weight of ownership, I'd lived with that my whole life, but the weight of responsibility. My grandfather always said the lake wasn't just property. It was part of the ranch's heart, and anything that touched it touched us. They didn't just cross a line, they paved over it. Sarah clicked one more link, a PDF marked Archived Materials. It opened to a list of project proposals. One, dated nearly a decade back, read, CP04 Lakeside Enhancement Project. Approved. The description said, to be built upon unused community land bordering HOA boundary. I pulled out the county survey from the table and laid it beside the laptop. The HOA boundary line wasn't anywhere near the lake back then. They didn't have a lakeside to improve. They used a phrase vague enough to pass, Sarah murmured, then built wherever they wanted. On my ranch, I said. On your ranch. I stepped back from the bench, rubbing my neck, feeling a mix of disbelief and something darker, something heavy, like betrayal from people who were never mine to begin with. Sarah closed her laptop. We have everything we need to file a complaint, but I suggest you send formal notices first. Let them know the game is over, and don't confront them face to face again unless I'm there. I nodded. Tonight they acted like a mob. They acted like people who think they're untouchable. I walked to the barn door and looked out at the pasture stretching wide under the morning light. The tall grasses swayed in unison, whispering secrets only the land could understand. The ranch was vast, steady, unwavering. It didn't bend because someone wished it would. Neither would I. Draft the notices, Ojai said. I'll sign whatever needs signing. Sarah gave a small nod, eyes resolute. This is the part they never see coming, the part where the paperwork fights back. I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief, but resolve. Stronger, clearer. The HOA had built their little world on my land. Now the paper trail would show everyone exactly where that world ended, and where mine began. By late afternoon, the Wyoming sky had turned the color of burnished brass, a kind of slow, glowing gold that stretched across the ridge and bled down into the valley. The breeze had picked up again, carrying the dusty scent of open fields and something colder underneath. Inevitability. Sarah had worked through the morning drafting every document we needed. 3 formal notices, printed crisp and exact on my old office printer. Unauthorized use of private property. Cease and desist. Revocation of access. Each one written with the precision only a land and water attorney could manage. She printed them on heavy stock paper, the kind that felt like it carried weight the moment you touched it. By noon, she handed them to me and said, once these are delivered, the lake becomes a legal silence. No more trespassing. No more events. No more pretending. I didn't know how much that silence would cost them, or how quickly it would suffocate their certainty. We drove back to the lake, pulling onto the narrow path with slow, deliberate rumbling over the dirt. The sun filtered through the trees, turning the edges of their leaves into thin lines of fire. The air tasted cleaner out here, untouched by the noise of arguments and paperwork. The lake sat still, almost too still. No kids splashing, no paddleboards gliding, no chatter from picnics or weekend gatherings. Just a glassy sheet of water reflecting the shape of the ridge. It struck me then how peaceful it had been before the HOA claimed it. Before their signs, their paths, their sense of ownership they wore like a uniform. The land didn't crave all that noise. It had its own voice, quiet, patient, enduring. Sarah stepped out of the SUV and nodded toward the ridge. Let's start with the gate. The original ranch gate wasn't much more than a heavy wooden crossbeam set between 2 thick posts, but it had always been symbolic. An entrance to coal land, a marker of what my grandfather built. Over the years, it had weathered into a kind of dignified silver gray, The grain of the wood raised like wrinkles on an old hand. Today it would mean something again. We mounted a chain across it, threaded through a steel ring, and affixed a new lock. The clink of metal echoed through the trees like a closing chapter. Sarah stapled the first notice to the gatepost, smoothing it flat with her palm. Private property. Access revoked. Unauthorized entry prohibited by law. The words felt colder on the page than they had in the drafts. Realer. Sharper. Next, we moved to the trailhead where the HOA had installed their ridiculous Community Lake Pathway sign, painted blue with a stylized heron on it. They'd even added a map behind a plastic cover showing HOA-friendly routes. Sarah shook her head. They treated your land like a park brochure. I pulled the screws free, one by one, until the sign tilted, then lifted it off the post entirely. The pole beneath, slim, metal, and undeniably out of place, looked like a foreign body planted in soil that had never asked for it. I carried the sign to the truck bed. It clattered down with a dull thud. Sarah posted another notice on the pole. Then we approached the dock. For something that had caused so much trouble, it was almost disappointingly plain. Wooden planks, pressure-treated boards, and a couple of cheap railings on the far end. It didn't belong. Not to the landscape, not to the water, and certainly not to the people claiming it. Sarah walked halfway down the dock and looked back at me. Remy, they held weddings here. I raised a brow. Weddings? She nodded. They posted pictures online. I found them this morning. I stared at the boards beneath her feet, trying to picture it. A bride and groom taking photos on this cheap, unauthorized platform, surrounded by a lake they believed was theirs simply because someone told them so. The kind of story that can only happen in neighborhoods where rules matter more than truth. Sarah came back toward shore and placed the third notice on a wooden post beside the dock entrance. All access suspended pending legal review, structures subject to removal. The breeze lifted the edges of the paper, making it flap softly like a warning flag. We stepped back, letting the silence settle. And it did. Heavy and immediate. No laughter, no fishing lines, no splashing. Just wind whispering through the pines and the quiet lap of water against the pilings. This is going to hit them hard, Sarah said softly. Good. She glanced at me. You're not gloating. No. I stared out over the lake, just tired of people rewriting what's true. We drove back up the trail, the SUV moving slower this time. I wanted to see the lake from the ridge, see it as my grandfather saw it, without the noise of entitlement. When we reached the rise, I stepped out and stood on the edge. The wind tugged at the hem of my jacket. The lake looked different. Not physically, it was the same shape, the same shimmer, the same stillness. But something had changed in the air around it. It wasn't being claimed anymore. Not by strangers. Not by anyone who didn't respect it. It was just itself. And for the first time in a long time, I felt that same quiet settling into me. But peace never lasts long when someone thinks you've taken what they believed was theirs. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills and painted the sky in streaks of copper and violet, my phone buzzed. I pulled it from my pocket and read the caller ID. Unknown number, I hesitated, just long enough to feel the breeze shift, then answered. Bethany's voice came through, sharper than any wind could ever cut. What have you done? She demanded. Her words trembled with something between disbelief and fury. We saw the notices. You cannot lock down community property. You have no right to bar residents from the lake. I walked out to the porch and leaned against the railing, watching dusk swallow the edges of the ranch. Bethany, I said quietly. I locked my gates. On my land. You're making a grave mistake, she hissed. You're provoking an entire neighborhood. and we will respond accordingly. I closed my eyes, letting her words roll off me like distant thunder. I'm not provoking anyone, I said. I'm protecting what's mine. She exhaled sharply. The board will convene tonight. Expect to hear from us. She hung up before I could respond. Sarah stepped out onto the porch behind me, arms crossed. Let me guess, she said. Bethany. I nodded. She won't stop, Sarah murmured. Not until she's forced to. The wind stirred again, carrying the cool scent of the lake all the way from the valley below. No, I said quietly. She won't. And for the first time, I realized the silence at the lake wasn't just peaceful. It was the silence before something else. Something coming. Because when you close a gate on people who believe they own the world beyond it, they don't sit quietly on the other side. They regroup, they galvanize, and they try to rewrite the world back into the shape they want. By the time morning light crept over the ridge the next day, the air already felt different, thicker somehow, like the whole valley was holding its breath. I stepped outside with a mug of coffee, boots crunching against the frosted boards of the porch, and could feel tension gathering the way clouds gather before a storm. Down by the lake, the water reflected an early glow that spread slowly across its surface. But the silence that had settled there yesterday felt heavier now, less like peace, more like anticipation. Sarah's SUV pulled up just after sunrise. She stepped out, hair pulled into a loose knot, files tucked under one arm, that sharp-eyed look she got whenever law and trouble crossed paths. We've got movement, she said before I could speak. The HOA filed something with the county late last night. What kind of something? She handed me her tablet. I scrolled. The words felt like they were pulsing off the screen. Application for shared use determination. Claim Northern Ridge Lake qualifies as community property based on historical use and maintenance by Oakview Estates, HOA. I closed my eyes for a long second. They're doubling down, Sarah said. Hard. I exhaled through my nose. Historical use? Maintenance? They attached photos, she said quietly. I scrolled again. Images of their gazebo, their dock, their trails, structures they'd built on land that had never been theirs. Pictures of families holding picnics, fishing off the dock, hosting barbecues. Photos polished with the kind of warmth you only see in HOA newsletters. None of them mentioned the truth. This was my lake, my land, my family's water. They're trying to paint a version of the story where you're the intruder, Sarah said softly. And Bethany's counting on the county taking the bait. I stared out toward the ridge. The sun was bright now, warming the tops of the pine trees. It felt like it was staring right back, watching all of this unfold like an audience. What do we do? I finally asked. She smiled faintly. We show the county the truth, and we do it today. Because the county had scheduled an emergency review meeting, and Bethany was already on her way. Marcus was waiting for us at the sheriff's office, leaning against his SUV with a binder tucked under one arm. The man had the kind of presence that didn't need words, a quiet firmness in the way he stood, boots planted like he'd grown roots there. I heard what they filed, he said, jaw tight. You're not the first rancher they've tried to box in, Remy, but you might be the first one they underestimated. His words settled deep, steadying something inside me. We followed him inside. The county meeting room was already filling. Board members, local residents, a couple of people I recognized from the HOA, clipboards in hand, faces tight with determination. And at the front table, Bethany herself, dressed in a charcoal gray blazer, pearl necklace, hair pulled clean and tight into a bun. Her expression was a mixture of triumph and fury, like she'd already written the ending of this story and was waiting for everyone else to read it. She didn't look at me. Not at first. But when my boots hit the wooden floor of the meeting room, her eyes flicked up. Sharp, cold, calculating. The meeting began with the dry shuffle of papers and the soft hum of murmurs settling into hush. The county commissioner called for both parties to present their claims. Bethany stood first. She walked to the podium, shoulders back, chin lifted. For 13 years, she began, Oakview Estates has maintained, improved, and cared for the lake known as North Mirror Point. Our residents have enjoyed it responsibly. We've invested time, money, and volunteer hours into making it a safe and welcoming space. A page flipped on her clipboard. She spoke louder. We have photo evidence, event records, and community logs. We've built on it, maintained it, improved it, and by all measures of historical use and community stewardship, it should be considered shared property. A few people nodded. Others murmured. Bethany glanced my way then, briefly, with the kind of smile predators make before lunging. Therefore, she continued, we request that the county recognize the lake as jointly used land, not private property belonging to Mr. Cole, who has only recently begun restricting access, after years of passive acceptance. Passive acceptance. She said it like I'd been asleep for a decade, like my silence was permission. Sarah leaned in, whispering, she's banking on sentiment, not facts. Then let's give them facts. The commissioner nodded for our turn. Sarah stood beside me at the podium, sliding a thick folder across the table to the board. County records show, she began evenly, that the lake and all surrounding structures fall entirely within the boundaries of Cole Ranch, registered under the Cole family since 1953. She opened the first map. Crisp lines, survey markings, deed numbers, coordinates. This is county approved. This is state verified. This is uncontested until last night. Bethany shifted. A flicker of uncertainty twitched at the corner of her mouth. Sarah continued. The HOA did not maintain this land. They trespassed. They built structures without permits. They collected dues on land they had no right to claim. They hosted events they advertised as community lake access, knowing full well there was no legal basis for it. She handed the board another set of documents. My grandfather's original deed. The old water mapping I'd pulled last night. The mineral and water rights filings that ran through my family's name like a spine. This lake was never theirs, she said. Not once. Not in any legal document. And as of last week's survey update, the county reaffirmed this fact. The commissioner raised a brow. Survey update? Marcus stepped forward, binder in hand. Submitted by my office, he said. Confirms the structures, dock, paths, gazebo, are entirely on Cole land, built without permission, without permits, and without disclosure. The room went silent, completely silent. Bethany's jaw tightened until the muscles near her ears trembled. She grabbed a folder and stepped forward. That survey, she said, voice cracking, does not override consistent community use and management. Marcus looked at her steadily. It does when that management was illegal. Her lips pressed thin. For a moment she looked like she might explode. Then she inhaled sharply and pulled out one last document. A map, old, yellowed at the edges. I have here, she said, the original planning map for Oakview Estates. It clearly shows the lake within our development outline. The commissioner took it, studied it, brows knitting together slowly. Ms. Reed, he said carefully, this document was filed yesterday. A ripple moved through the room. Someone whispered. Someone else sucked in air. Sarah leaned forward. And it uses survey lines and reference codes that didn't exist 13 years ago. Commissioner, this isn't old. He nodded grimly. It isn't. Bethany froze, completely. For the first time since this war began, she looked like someone who'd realized her army wasn't behind her anymore. Sarah lifted another folder. "This is the real planning map," she said, laying it down beside Bethany's. "Filed by the county at the start of the development. The lake is explicitly excluded, marked as private ranch land, and signed by the Cole family and the developer." Bethany didn't speak. Couldn't. The commissioner folded his hands. "Ms. Reed, did you attempt to submit falsified documentation to the county?" Her throat bobbed. Color drained from her face. But she didn't answer. And sometimes silence is louder than guilt. Marcus stepped closer, voice low, controlled. "Commissioner, we have what we need." No one in the room exhaled until the commissioner spoke again. "The county rules in favor of Mr. Remy Cole. The lake is private property. The structures built by the HOA must be removed, and further action will be taken regarding falsified documentation." The murmur that followed was a tidal wave. Shock, disbelief, realization. Bethany stared straight ahead, shoulders shaking once, then going still. She never looked at me. Not as the board gathered the papers, not as the room emptied, not as the truth finally landed on her like the weight of the ridge itself. I stepped outside into the cool Wyoming air. The breeze carried the scent of pine and distant water. Sarah walked beside me, her hand brushing my arm once, a quiet reminder that this fight had never been mine alone. The ridge stood tall in the distance. The lake shimmered beneath it. And for the first time, the truth didn't feel like something I was fighting toward. It felt like something standing with me. The Wyoming afternoon was turning soft around the edges. Those quiet hours when the sun dips low, but hasn't yet given in. When everything in the valley looks washed in warm honey light. I stepped outside the county building, letting the door close behind me with a slow, hollow thud. Sarah and Marcus flanked me like bookends, but neither said a word. They didn't have to. Some victories don't arrive with cheering. Some arrive with nothing more than silence. A breath, a loosened jaw, a weight sliding off your shoulders like a saddle unbuckled after a long, punishing ride. I breathed deeper than I had in days, maybe weeks. Sarah glanced at me. "You all right?" I nodded. "Feels like the land finally spoke for itself." "And the county listened," she said, pride warming the corners of her voice. Marcus gave a grunt, his version of approval. "Told you the truth has long legs, always outruns the lies." We parted ways in the parking lot. Marcus drove back toward town, radio crackling faintly as he pulled off. Sarah headed toward her office to prep final paperwork for the removal order. And I climbed into my old pickup and let the engine rumble steady under me before heading home. The dirt road back to the ranch looked different now, though nothing had changed. Same willow trees leaning just slightly toward the lake. Same dust rising like pale smoke behind my tires. Same wooden fence rails running the length of the ridge. Same gate at the end of the road. But something in me had shifted. Something I hadn't realized I'd been carrying had finally unlatched. I parked the truck beside the barn and walked down to the lake alone. The sky was stretching into those deep evening colors, navy, wine red, the barest hint of gold lingering on the horizon. The air tasted cooler, cleaner, as if the water itself had exhaled after being held wrong for years. The dock stood where it always had, crooked, worn, out of place. But today it had all the authority of a trespasser caught in the act. Its presence felt smaller, temporary, like a guest who overstayed their welcome and finally realized the door wasn't theirs to walk through. Tomorrow the county's removal team would take it apart, plank by plank. Same for the gazebo and the trail the HOA carved without permission. But tonight, the lake just rested. I walked to the shoreline, boots sinking an inch into damp earth. The water glimmered in the last thin thread of daylight, ripples reaching out in slow, soft circles. My grandfather had fished here. My father had swum here. I had grown up learning to measure water depths off this very bank. And now people who didn't own a single inch of it had tried to rewrite its story. Not anymore. I stood there until the sky turned fully dark. The stars began stitching themselves across the night, one by one. A breeze tugged at the collar of my jacket, carrying the faint scent of pine sap and river root. Then came a sound behind me, soft footsteps on dirt. I turned. Sarah stood there, hands in her pockets, hair blowing gently in the wind. "You didn't go home," I said. "You didn't either." She stepped to my side. "Thought I'd check on you." I smiled. "I'm all right. Better than all right." She looked out over the water. "You know, most people would have folded the moment the HOA called the cops, or when Bethany tried to turn the whole neighborhood against you. Most people don't have a deed older than the HOA president," I said dryly. She laughed, quiet and warm. "True, but you also didn't swing fists, didn't yell, didn't threaten. You just let the paperwork speak. That's what my grandfather taught me. Land doesn't shout. And if you protect it right, you don't have to either." For a long while, we just listened, to the water, to the wind, to the quiet that comes after a storm. A quiet that wasn't empty, but earned. "You know," she said finally, "they're going to owe you quite a bit once the county tallies everything. Fines, fees, restitution for unauthorized structures, legal penalties. That's before the HOA's own members start asking why their dues were used illegally." I shrugged. "Money's not the part I care about." "What is?" "That fence line staying where it belongs." I pointed toward the ridge. "And the lake staying just the way it was meant to." She nodded slowly. "Well, it will." A pair of headlights appeared in the distance. Marcus again. His SUV rolled up beside the lake, tires crunching against gravel. He stepped out and waved a thick envelope at me. "County rushed the paperwork," he said. "Didn't want this dragging through the weekend." He handed it to me. The envelope was heavy. Inside, I could feel the weight of signatures, seals, decisions. I opened it. The county's ruling stared back at me in clean black ink. Full ownership affirmed. HOA structures ordered for removal. HOA fined for unauthorized land use. All future access subject to owner approval. Marcus tipped his hat. "Congratulations, Remy." Sarah smiled. "That's the truth in writing." I folded the papers gently and slipped them into my jacket. The night wind carried the faint rustle of them, like the land whispering its approval. We stood together for a moment longer, until the cold began to creep through our sleeves. Sarah and Marcus eventually headed back to their vehicles, leaving me alone by the shoreline. I breathed in the air, clean, cool, unclaimed. When I walked back to the tent pitched near the dock, I caught my reflection in the lake. It wasn't pride looking back at me, or revenge. It was something steadier, something older, something that felt rooted deep in the soil under my boots. Justice. Not loud, not flashy. Just there, like the water, like the land, like the truth. The lake didn't change today, but everything around it did. Tomorrow would bring cleanup crews and county trucks and the slow process of restoring what the HOA had claimed as theirs. But tonight, under the sweep of Wyoming stars, the land rested easy again. And for the first time in a long time, so did I. Sometimes standing your ground is the quietest kind of courage. If you've ever dealt with an HOA or fought for what's yours, drop a justice in the comments. And if you'd like more stories about land, truth, and the folks who refuse to be pushed off their own dirt, consider subscribing. I'd be glad to have you here.